Hello, heretics. Welcome to the second episode of Veritas Voices. I'm sorry that Nick couldn't be here, but Renee and I are, so I hope you have plenty of questions for us. My name, if you don't know, is Lilith Liberated. That's what I go by on Twitter. And Renee, if you'd like to introduce yourself to the folks at home.
Yeah, hello everyone, I'm Renee. I'm from Germany. I also am on Twitter. I go by the name @Revelation. It's a sort of a wordplay on my real name, Renee, and Revelation. And yeah, we are here to discuss the topic of divine hiddenness today. So maybe I should just lay out basically the issue.
Rundown in simplified form, obviously.
Yeah, so I'm not going to lay out like an argument with premises, but sort of the general issue at hand. So the problem of divine hiddenness, what is it? Basically, what I would argue, or what the people who are proponents of this argument or of the problem of divine hiddenness argues that if God exists, like the Christian God specifically, or pretty much any God, an intervention who wants us to be saved and wants us to go to heaven, then it should be generally known that he exists. It should be like as obvious as pretty much known, or the existence of humans or things like that. So the main issue concerning this is, I hear myself double speak. I have an echo on my part, I think.
Okay. I had a little trouble with my mic, but I wasn't talking, so I didn't say anything about it. So the idea being essentially that if there are good reasons to not believe in God, then there is no reason to believe in an interventionist God. This wouldn't address kind of a deistic, pantheistic idea of God, a God who started off the universe, buggered off, and we never heard from him again. But the kind of religious, I care about what you do, and if you kiss the wrong people, I get my feelings hurt for some reason, kind of a God.
And it's a God who basically wants to have a relationship with us, who wants us to be saved, wants us to spend eternity in heaven with him. And if that is the case, if that God does exist, then it would stand to reason that pretty much every human has a propositional knowledge or a propositional belief that he exists, because it's kind of difficult to have a relationship with a being whose existence one does not believe in, or whose existence one is not aware of. So, and this also has a kind of a scriptural basis, like 1 Timothy 2:4, I think it was, says that God wants everyone to come to believe in his existence, and wants everyone to be saved.
Yeah, to come to the knowledge of truth and so forth.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of those.
Yeah. And the really important part is that he wants to have sort of this relationship, this bond with us. And in order to achieve that, it would stand to reason that everyone would be aware of his existence. So pretty much the fact that his existence is not obvious to...
Oh, did we lose Renee? Oh, I tell you, those connections from Germany. But I have to say on that point, I think that presuppositionalism has been largely a response to divine hiddenness. There is that one verse that says something to the effect of everyone has a knowledge of God, or that God has revealed those parts of himself that could be made known so that people are without excuse. But if you hear... Hi, Renee. Oh.
Hold on, Renee. You're not in the broadcast yet.
Renee's getting set up. But as I was saying, a lot of presuppositions have now presuppositionalists have now come and taken that to the degree where they will tell people on the street, you really believe in God. I know you really know that he's real. As if by declarational fiat, they could just know the inside of our heads.
Yeah.
Even when I was a Christian, I couldn't do this. It was beyond ridiculous to assume that I knew what was in someone else's head better than they did. So I was never a presuppositionalist. Yay, 1 point for me. But it's one of the things you're made to suppress is the incredible awkwardness of going up to a stranger and telling them about this deep and personal love that a non-present third party has for them.
Well, I think the argument from divine hiddenness or the argument from non-belief is not really an argument that you would present to a presuppositionalist, which is also one of the important points to realize about these arguments when we present them, is that there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all argument against all gods. For instance, if I speak with a deist, then I'm not going to use the argument from non-belief or the problem of divine hiddenness or whatever you may call it, because he does really believe in an interventionist God, so he does believe that God necessarily wants to have a relationship with us.
Or necessarily even the problem of evil. If your God is not defined as someone who is going to get their hands dirty in human affairs, they aren't going to have anything to say about that. They might not even technically know we exist, so that there might be a God which nonetheless was in effect for us as though there were no God, because we have no interaction or reason to interact. I'm going to have to do a video on why I wear this mask, because this is the second time. Was it Mr. Dinvader both times who wanted to ask about the eyes wide shut orgies?
Yeah, I don't remember who that was, but somebody thought that your mask meant you were on your way to a eyes wide shut meeting.
Same here this time.
What? Oh, okay. Well, like we tried to tell you, Lilith, you should keep your nose out of the live chat and just discuss the topic, because they can be vicious in the live chat sometimes.
Oh, please. As if anything that silly could upset me. The only thing that could really upset me is having my coffee taken away, because it's morning for me, and thou shalt not touch my coffee or I shall smite thee. With a furious rage. You've never understood my love of coffee, Renee.
Yeah, I'm not a particular coffee guy. There are other beverages for me, like hot chocolate or beer or, other things.
They're all fine. They're just not coffee. But actually, I wonder, because I haven't heard the argument for divine hiddenness used much in actual debate with theists. Unfortunately, a lot of the debate I've seen has been on Twitter. So there's been a lot of the type of people who will try and tell you what's in your head while they're talking to you. I
mean, I tend to use it like not really as an argument, but I tend to use various points from the argument. Like, for instance, one thing which typically comes up is that it is not God who needs to seek out me and who needs to reveal himself to me. It's me who sort of needs to seek out God. But this
which is rather silly, you would think.
Yeah, and this objection, as far as I'm concerned, fails for the reason that I'm not aware of his existence and he is aware of my existence. He is the one who wants to have a relationship with me. So if he knows exactly where I am and if he wants to have this active relationship, if he wants to have that bond, then it should be he who should seek me out and who should try to build something up.
You know what it strikes me as? It's a bit like taking a small orphan and putting them in a very, very large shopping center and saying, your new daddy is here and he really wants to adopt you because he loves you so much. If you can find him in the next hour, you'll be adopted. If not, you have to go to the workhouse and be beaten. Have fun, and not give the kid a picture.
Yeah. And I think adoption is sort of, or the father-child relationship is a good example, because God, the God of the Bible, or I think the God pretty much of any interventionist religion, any form of theism that proclaims a active God, a God who wants to have a relationship with us, is sort of a father figure, right? So,
well, and they very often call the father figure, which, you know, I'm sure completely coincidentally is what a lot of dictators call themselves: the father, the padre, the fatherland, the, you know, the rest of it. I mean, just it's actually incredibly creepy when you realize, I'm sorry, growing up in it, I had to suppress how creepy it was for so many years, and then I look back and I go, ugh, I can't believe I was involved in that. It's far creepier than an Eyes Wide Shut orgy.
So, sort of when you have this father figure that wants to have a relationship with you, and you are sort of the child who has been adopted, who may even not be aware that this person even exists, and it would be unreasonable to demand the child to seek the father figure out, but it would be reasonable to expect the father figure to show himself and to make it known that, hey, listen, I'm your biological father, I want to have that bond with you, and I'm reaching out to you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We recognize that in situations where there is an imbalance of power, the responsibility belongs on the individual with the greater power to accommodate the individual with less power, because there's literally no other way for that to function. But to pretend there is well, can lead to incredibly abusive scenarios. And it's funny. When I got out of the faith, I spent months listening to Hitchens as a detail. Sorry.
You have interruptions with the sound. I don't completely hear you, like you have breaks.
Is this better?
Yeah, much.
I found his...
the sound is off again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, yep, we can.
Okay, you know what? I'm not going to use this. I'm going to use the internal microphone for now, because that's going to be more stable, and I'm going to get several new connections for this, apparently. But in any event,
it sounds great. If you're using the internal mic on the computer, it's fine. It works when we're not getting any feedback either. So
good. As long as I'm clear.
But to bottom line, pretty much the problem of divine hiddenness is that this God who is proposed wants to have a relationship with us, yet his existence is not apparent to Muslims, to Hindus, to atheists who may actually want to have a relationship with him, and to sort of want to have that bond, to want to be saved, to want to enjoy heaven. And that fact that this is not the case, that this father figure has not reached out to us, needs to be accounted for. One way to account for it is to go ahead and say that it's probably not true that this father figure exists and that it's all a myth. That would account for him not reaching out to us. And
that would account for it.
Yeah, and there may be other ways to account for it, but the ones which I've heard so far pretty much all fail.
Well, that's the thing. It's a bit like, honestly, dealing with creationists. They always have one excuse or explanation against a specific point, which might, on its own, be plausible. Potentially. But if you take it in chorus with the others, you end up with 6 or 7 different contradictory arguments to try and sort of plug all the holes being poked in a view that clearly doesn't work.
Yeah.
If there's anyone in the chat who wants, I'm actually interested to know what are people's favorite arguments for and against God, because the divine hiddenness argument, I think it requires a certain amount of intellectual honesty from your interlocutor to believe and accept that you genuinely don't believe and are not insane. That might make more sense if the person knew you and could, you know, they could take you at your word. So it's a, you know, it's a question. Where would you put yourself on the Dawkins scale?
Like me?
Mm-hmm.
I would probably say a 6.9, sort of in that range. I do positively believe that there are no gods. I don't know it 100%, but I do think it's very, very improbable that any god of any kind exists. What about you?
See, I want to put myself at a 7 because I do consider myself a Gnostic atheist, and I'll give the justification for that in a moment. But at the same time, it wouldn't be a correlation to the I absolutely know God exists Christian or other believer, because in general, they will say that nothing could change their mind. And of course, that's not the case with me. My mind has been changed before, clearly. So my mind can be changed at any time by sufficient evidence.
I think it also kind of depends on about which god you're talking about. I mean, there are certain gods which, for example, the Christian God who is omnipotent, I do not see how I could ever be persuaded that such a God exists, for the mere reason that very, very powerful and omnipotent, I don't see how one can distinguish between these two features.
From our perspective, you could. What is it the saying? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic?
I mean, let's say, for instance, a very powerful God, he could sort of maybe create a BMW ex nihilo. Well, that's impressive, but how about 2? Can he create 2 BMWs ex nihilo? How about 3? How about 4? How about...
As long as I can have one. Daryl Frost asks if sufficient evidence is even possible. I've had many believers tell me no, from the point of view of the type of evidence I've asked for. They try and pretend that they have evidence for God, they just can't see God, and the seeing is the part of the evidence that we have a problem with. I'm like, no, I have evidence. You know, I can't see quantum mechanics. I can see that my phone is a computer, a tiny computer because of that. You know, I can't see the Higgs boson, but we made experiments to test that. Well, physicists made, let's face it. I didn't actually build the
collider. I have a question from the chat. Daryl Frost asks, is sufficient evidence even possible?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. For me, what would require sufficient evidence is a clear definition of God. Because the reason I call myself a Gnostic atheist is that if you ask people for their definition of God, I've only ever experienced one of 3 answers. 1, you have a God that is knowably, demonstrably false, created the earth 6,000 years ago and made a big flood that never happened. You have a God that's self-contradictory. A lot of the omni-everything gods fit into that. I'm omnipotent and omniscient and immortal and omni blah, 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 blah. The characteristics themselves become logical contradictions. I mean, God can't kill himself, presumably. So that's a thing he can't do, so he's not omnipotent. Then there's things like the sort of whimsy definitions you get from people who want you to look at a rainbow and be overwhelmed. Definitions that could literally apply to anything and don't function as definitions. So in order for me to have sufficient evidence, I'd need a clear functional definition that actually, you know, worked as one of the God we're defining. A testable, predictable model that would actually allow the hypothesis to be falsified. If you don't have a way to demonstrate God that would also demonstrate not God, then you're stacking the deck, and that's not honest. So, yeah, just I need it to stand to the same degree of evidence as any scientific hypothesis. I need a falsifiable hypothesis and a test that could go either.
Hey Lilith, your biggest fan in the chat, Mr. Dinvader, wants to know, wait, why can't God kill himself?
Well, I would be quite happy if he did in the event he existed, but presumably that would conflict with his immortality, which really is just another omni characteristic, omni life.
I also kind of want to jump on that bandwagon which you brought up with definitions. I do think that it depends on which God we're talking about with sufficient evidence. I think for an omnipotent being, like I said earlier with the BMWs, like this creation with BMWs would go on ad infinitum. I mean, if there would be no end, and we could never ever distinguish between a very, very powerful being and an omnipotent being. So I don't think there could ever be sufficient evidence for the Christian God. I don't think that. But
well, yeah, and in fairness, I have heard different versions of the Christian God, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Some that would have not quite the traditional understanding of omnipotent.
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
But if you speak, for example, of a generic creator, like a personal agent who just created the universe, if you mean that by God, then one thing that would be sufficient would be video footage. You know, just show me that he did it, and then I'll accept it.
Oh, God, how come you didn't invent a quick, a Sony camcorder at the time? Jeez, what's wrong with you? Couldn't you just time travel or not time travel since you're outside space and time? I have heard some argue, actually, or, well, it wasn't so much argue as right. God, was it even? I can't remember if it was, I can't remember who it was, but they said essentially declaring a belief in an all-powerful God outside of time and space was essentially the same thing as declaring a belief in no God, because what you're defining is literally nothing. Nothing is all-powerful. Nothing exists outside time and space. Nothing. It's not a thing. It's a non-thing. So technically, yeah, I could say I believe in that God because he's an impossibility. So I believe he is an impossibility. So sure, that works. In a kind of reverse logic kind of a way.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is, yeah, it's a lot of people who are sentimentally attached to the idea of God. They want to say God is all around us, but they mean by that literally everything from the interaction of subatomic particles at the birth of our universe to the warm and fuzzy feeling that I feel within my heart when I look upon a rainbow. And that's not a definition. You're not talking about anything. You're literally talking about everything and nothing. So what am I supposed to do with that?
Nothing. I mean, like if God is everywhere, and if he is everywhere to be found, then it should be trivially easy to just show me where he is, right? I mean,
you would think.
Still, if you look at the trees, I mean, one often says, or theists often say, like the stereotype is that one argument is the argument from trees. Like, look at the trees; they had to have a creator, but still, even if you look at the trees, you still have to make the jump from tree all the way to creator.
You know what actually cured me of my admiration for the design argument?
No, share.
Years ago, decades in fact, there was a very interesting to me because I'm a nerd, but there was an interesting documentary on fractal geometry. Are you familiar with the concept?
No, not really.
Mandelbrot set, have you heard of that?
I think so, maybe. Like I heard the term, but I don't know what it
Okay,
really
well,
is.
Mandelbrot was actually a mathematician, and he first discovered these. What they are is very simple equations that have like your x and y on both sides of the equation, but instead of an equal sign, it feeds back and forth into itself. And if you put in any two values, it'll either grow to infinity or go down to nothing or near nothing. And if you graph this out, you will end up with the same pattern repeating on every conceivable level, large and small, but with slight variations every time, but so slight you could barely even tell. And so this is where you get infinite complexity from something very, very, very simple by just repeating it, and repeating it with slight variation where that, you know, the circumstances allow that. That's what broke me of the assumptions that a lot of believers are told to have, that every cause has to be greater than the effect, or that every cause has to understand the effect, which is silly. Because snowball effect, avalanche, these things don't understand, nor are they technically greater than. So that, I mean, that demonstrated to me how infinite complexity could come from almost infinite simplicity through repetition. And then once you've got that, all you need is for matter to exist and have its own attributes and state. And then that's it. You have everything. You have the whole damn universe if you wait around long enough.
Yeah. I actually would take it even further and say that pretty much all complexity is always emergent. I mean, if you, for example, take a look at a car, it always gets composed out of simpler parts into something more complex. So if you look at pregnancy, sperm, and a sperm isn't really as complex as a human, right? And during the process of pregnancy, it becomes constantly more complex when the brain develops and the heart and all the organs. So
and then start connecting. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think complexity is pretty much always emergent. I haven't seen an example where it wouldn't be emergent, but that's just by the by.
No, I think you're quite right. And I think the confusion is that with science trying to understand things, what it very naturally did was start to break things down into their pieces. And some people seem to have taken great offense to that, as though they were spoiling the mystery. But then you just find more mysteries, so it's fun. What are you worried about? But I have not yet encountered an argument for or a concept of God that didn't rely on keeping something undefined and nebulous, of trying to, you know, define morality not as what we owe to each other because we are sentient beings who understand the consequences of our actions, but as something nebulous and abstract and objective, as in existing outside of ourselves and any sentient being, like a, you know, in the same way a rock would. And that just isn't what that is. It doesn't make any sense.
One thing which I do want to do right now, though, is, and I hope you will forgive me for this, but I would want to sort of return back to the topic of the divine hiddenness argument, and I would like to ask John if there may be any questions in the chat concerning the issue.
I don't think he's listening to us, so I'll say ask in the chat.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just got a phone call from a family member. What did you ask? What did you ask me, Renee?
If there were sort of any questions, any points concerning the divine hiddenness argument, or pretty much any point, any suggestion, any comment about what we're discussing.
Well, just the questions that I you know, interrupted with so far. they're kind of like talking back and forth about themselves. Another subject. They're talking about
camels.
But they're listening. They're listening to you folks with half an ear and talking about camels in the chat. So
yeah.
Well,
I mean, camels are interesting.
Actually, I think the relationship between camels and llamas is more interesting. But because they were mentioning Noah's flood and the whole, genotype things. But I'm actually more curious about, if any of them have anything to say about arguments for and against God, because I've had many people, come into these types of things. Does God exist, or God just declaring God does exist? But it often goes along the points of the things we've already discussed.
Yeah.
Look at the trees. Everything had to come from something, with the, background assumptions that something had to be knowledgeable about this. And then,
I mean,
just assume it has to be God.
I mean, to be fair, the look at the trees argument, I mean, it would be sort of a sound argument if God actually did create the trees, right? But there's an obvious difference between a sound argument and a valid argument and a persuasive argument. I mean, for instance,
honestly, I feel feelings when I look at pretty always felt like something a child should say to me. Like, I'm not going to rag on a 5-year-old who says that because, okay, pretty, but I was always hoping for something a little more intellectually rigorous from adults, but.
And this is pretty much also why I do like like the two best arguments in my mind are for or against God's existence, and sort of implicitly for atheism, the Hiddenness argument, as well as the problem of suffering or the problem of evil, or whatever you want to go by.
Because, the problem of evil.
Because you can, I can talk with Christians all day about the hypostatic union being incoherent, or the Trinity being nonsense, or the Bible being full of myths, but it's not likely to persuade them. I mean, the points that you can raise about God, about the definition of God being logically coherent and that sort of stuff, I do think all those arguments are sound and valid, but I don't think that these arguments are in any way persuasive. I do think that the problem of suffering, the problem of divine hiddenness, I think those arguments actually have the power to intellectually put seeds in mind or cause people to doubt.
That is possible. And the truth of the matter is, because we don't, if we're just rejecting a God claim, we don't technically have a burden of proof. We tend to not put forward arguments against God, which, technically I can understand that. And yet, when you're trying to actually reach people from a certain emotional standpoint, you have a type of a burden of proof to move them from their current position.
Yeah, you have to sort of offer something persuasive yourself if you want to.
Well, people don't.
Seeds.
There's a sort of inertia kind of a burden of proof to move someone from their position, even if it is genuinely an irrational position, does require something persuasive. And it's possible that the hiddenness argument or the problem of evil would matter to people in a way that the incoherence of a God definition wouldn't necessarily change people's mind about. So what other arguments do you find persuasive against God?
I mean, this sort of ties in with the problem of evil, but one point which I also often raise is like sort of animal suffering, right? Like, for example, with evolution, which many Christians do not accept, but if they do accept it, then you run into the problem with the 5 extinction events. Right, like the Great Dying, it's rumored that in the aftermath of the Great Dying, the greatest extinction on Earth, that there were up to 10 million years of animal suffering, and that's
sad. It's sad.
And the thing about animal suffering, or about evolution, or these extinction events, is that you can't blame humans for that, because humans were not around at that time.
Well,
So,
and I
so that
don't.
is suffering that that is not caused by humans. So the free will card is done for, and the suffering also, to my mind, was necessary because while we could have risen another way, like while we did rise as a result of the Great Dying, God could have just like he described in Genesis, just created everything ex nihilo, and bring humans about that on the sixth day,
Or simply not made death of such horrors and like the starvation and suffocation and all these horrible ways that thinking creatures suffer. There are lots of animals that, clams or something, do they even have enough cognition to consider suffering? There are some vegans who feel okay eating them because they're that dumb. But that's not, the majority of the animals we interact with, and certainly of the ones that went extinct during that period. It's unfathomable, and I don't like to think about it. It's one of the things actually a vegetarian brought up. They were like, it's so cruel to kill animals for food. And I'm not against, there are lots of arguments to be made for the broader environmental impact of our animal consumption. And I don't want to get into that because I do see some validity there, but that's not what I'm focusing on right now. I was focusing on the point of suffering alone. And I remember saying.
So can I ask you a question of clarification? When you were given the clam example, you said that they're that dumb. Does that really have any bearing on a being's capacity to suffer?
Well, yes, absolutely. The brain is, in as far as we have ever been able to understand, the only way that there could be a thing suffering. I mean, you can, as someone said last week, you can shock a dead body and, the arm will twitch, but nobody is experiencing that without something like a brain on some level. And granted, it doesn't have to look like our brain. But if there isn't anything receiving a pain signal, then nothing is conceivably suffering.
Well, I guess I was being pedantic there. To me the word dumb entails a brain, but
right, and clams don't really even. I mean, they barely have reactionary neural tissue, so it's very. Yeah, it's very limited what they could conceivably be imagined to be suffering. But when you see animals hunted in the wild, that's very much not the case. You see a lot of very terrible suffering, and it's very unfortunate.
Also, what I sort of want to present is like another sort of argument, or just a thought, since you brought up the brain. Are you familiar with the case of Phineas Gage?
I know that name, but I can't recall the story at the moment. Please.
Phineas Gage was, I think he was a construction worker or something like that, and he sort of got like I don't know.
Was he the one where there was an explosion and like a big piece of metal shot up into his head?
Yeah.
And it damaged part of his frontal cortex or the connection between or something, but then they pulled it out and he had a big hole in his head, lived, and everyone was like, how did he live?
Yeah, but the thing is that he, as a result of this brain injury, changed completely as a person. Like before that, he was like a nice guy, a sort of funny guy, I think, and after that, he was a completely different person in that sense. So one theological problem which arises is he sort of accountable for the sins post-injury when it is a result of brain damage? If it is a result of an accident, like, can he be accountable for that, and can God punish him for his behavior as an agent for which he has zero responsibility?
I remember hearing about that, and that someone had said it was like the accident had knocked out his conscience. Like he just had no conscience after that. But prior to that, he had, it was clearly a before and after thing. Brain injuries are a terrible thing, but they provide excellent study opportunities.
Yeah. And another example which I've heard of is that I think there was a guy who sort of was kind of a pedophile, or he was a pedophile, but it was found out that his pedophilia was a result of a brain tumor. So the brain tumor got removed, and he didn't have these tendencies anymore. Then, these tendencies came back, these pedophilia tendencies, and it was shown that these tendencies came back because the brain tumor came back, and after the tumor was removed again, then was fine again. So this also poses like the difficulty. I presume that pedophilia is a sin, but it would be like a sin for which he is not responsible for, since it's a result of his brain.
Well,
so
and that's
also
the tendency in a case like that would be something he was not responsible for. He would still be responsible for his actions. And that's the thing, is empathy is what drives us to do good to each other and to try and minimize suffering and increase well-being, because we can feel echoes of each other's suffering and each other's happiness and everything else. But people without empathy, and sociopaths and narcissists and psychopaths, or with very, very limited empathy, and they don't feel that same moral imperative that the rest of us do. But they can, by law, at least be made to conform to a certain amount of societal restriction, because we all live here, and there are still consequences to your actions.
Yeah. I mean, the person would absolutely be responsible for his actions if he were to rape a child. But I think you and I both are aware that Christianity is also in the business of convicting people for thought crime.
Oh, yes. Oh, that was always creepy. That was creepy. Depending on what denomination of Christianity you're in, God can read your mind. And if you're really unfortunate, like an evangelical or a Mormon, you're told that at the final judgment, a tape will be played of your entire life and every thought you've ever had in front of you, and God and the angels and the saints, which will include everyone you've ever known and probably your parents. Try and think of any thought you've had in the whole course of your life that you would not want displayed on that screen.
Yeah.
Try and imagine how paranoid that makes you as a child.
Yeah. Also, since we sort of went through two of my favorite arguments, or technically three, like, what are your favorite arguments, or do you have certain favorites?
Against God?
Against God, yeah.
The definitional one is, I think, the most important one for me. I find the problem of evil convincing for myself, but I find it infuriating to try and use, because the people you interact with, according to Christian doctrine of original sin, which granted not everybody is on board with that anymore in the same literal way, but like everything is our fault. The whirlwinds and volcanoes and everything are the result of sin and therefore our fault. So it's this incredibly abusive setup where everything good is to God's credit and everything bad, whether we suffer from it personally or not, is to our blame. And I find that mindset unbearable to interact with, because it's like talking to someone who's in an incredibly toxic, abusive relationship who wants you to join them. And they're gaslighting you the whole time so that you can be a co-victim. And sorry, John?
No, I just wanted, somebody asked in the chat, why do you argue against something that doesn't exist?
Because I hate lies, and lies are what is being told. So I object to lies.
Yeah.
Next question.
Also, I want to address that because while I don't think that God does exist, God belief does exist, and I don't think that God belief is good for the individual as well as for other people, because that belief affects other beliefs, it affects choices, and if you base sort of your entire epistemology on a lie, then that is harmful. And all of us are affected by people who believe in God. All of us are affected by the beliefs of others and the actions of others. So I think it's important to speak out about this issue, because it's important and because people base their lives and their decisions on a lie, like Lilith said.
And I'd like to say God of Spaghetti here, or Spaghetti, pardon me, says we argue about fictional things all the time and they don't need to be, existentially real for us to discuss them. Yeah. And that is true. Winter is coming. I mean, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Marvel versus DC nerds. Get those people in a room, start them arguing about their mythical universes, and tell me they don't sound like a band of theologians fighting over the nature of the Trinity or pre-trib, post-trib, predestination versus, like any of those things.
Actually, on this very channel last night, there was a debate about Marvel versus DC.
I believe it. That's actually a far more fun topic than predestination versus free will. But, people still get very heated, and I don't think they actually think Thor is out there somewhere with his hammer.
Yeah. I mean, I also, in my personal life, watch Harry Potter theory videos all the time. I have various subscriptions to Harry Potter YouTube channels which dedicate their entire content on fiction, and I also frequently like to think about these issues. I like to read about it. I also like to discuss it. So one can discuss fiction without taking it to be real.
Absolutely. And Bully the Anti-Billy, oddly appropriate name, keeps asking if we can disprove God. And that depends. If we're on the Great Debate channel and we're talking about a philosophical absolute disproof, then no, that's not, you can't prove a negative in that sense. If you're talking about beyond a reasonable doubt, then yes, provided you give a clear definition of the God you wish to discuss. And that's the other thing, is that the more nebulous definitions of God keep him out of the realm of being proven or not proven. And so it's not demonstrated, but it's not demonstrated, but it can't be, because there are an endless layers and layers of excuses for why you can't really be certain you would see X or Y. Yeah. And then, it just becomes a game of making up excuses. And you can spend your whole life doing that. You can spend your whole life making excuses for why God never meets anybody's expectations. But the simplest reason is he isn't fucking there.
Yeah. And what is important is, to clarify what exactly does he mean by God. The Christian God, does he mean Allah? Does he mean Vishnu? The Christian God, is he a Unitarian? Is he a Trinitarian? Those things are important, and based on his position, which would need to be laid out, then I can then I think I can make good arguments which would show that his God very likely doesn't exist, or doesn't exist for certain.
True. And that's, again, that comes back to the definition thing. And it's not even that I necessarily give the argument from non-definition, if you want to call it that, but that I ask people to give a definition first, and then we will discuss what you're talking about. Because if you're going to claim a God, let's be quite clear. And I'm not even talking about different gods like, Thor, Zeus, Allah, blah, blah, blah. I'm talking about, if you really think there is one creator God, give a definition and tell me what we're talking about, so that we can have a clear discussion. And I can't get that out of people. And I think it's very telling that I can't. Because, they'll say he's omnipotent, but only in accordance with his own attributes. Well, then bloody hell, I'm omnipotent. I can't fly by an act of pure will, but that's only because it conflicts with my other natural attributes. It's not because I'm not omnipotent. It's like,
by that definition, literally everything is omnipotent. Like my beer can right here is omnipotent.
Yeah, it can do anything that doesn't conflict with its other characteristics.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Well, there. How do you feel about being omnipotent, Renee?
It's nothing special.
Not all
No.
it's cracked up to be. Ah, true enough.
So,
Yeah.
your personal troll in the chat there, Lilith, Mr. Dinvader, he says, it's not really a question, but he says, I bet none of you have even read the Bible.
In
God,
two
where's
languages, in German and in English.
well, I can't tell if he's a troll or just being sarcastic. Yes, this is the Bible of a person who has never read the Bible. That's the entire Pentateuch highlighted by authorship. I also did the same to Isaiah. I've made notes all through the New Testament. Yeah, this is the Bible of someone who's never read a Bible. Look at that. Totally pristine, just like the day I got it.
Yeah. And
Bible drop.
Yeah.
Bible drop. Yeah, that's the new mic drop.
Yeah. And while I never was a Christian because I was raised theist, sort of, I also read the Bible in both German and in English, and I also read the Quran. So.
You know, I've got a Quran. I haven't gotten through it lately. I've been just busy with too many other things. I have so many reading books. But CC Sleeper had an interesting question. Do they argue about which German translation is true? And I also want to know, is there like a King James version only kind of German version?
To be honest, I don't know. Like when I read the Bible in German, I read it sort of on the internet, and I just went by the next best translation and then read it. So I don't think there's a big dispute in Germany about which translation is the accurate one. There are various translations, but for me, or I think pretty much to
but you haven't
Germans, which I know.
Anyone who would die on the hill of the one translation being the true German translation, the only reliable, inspired, blah, 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 blah.
Well, one thing which you have to understand is that in Germany, we are rather liberal with religion. Like, religion is not typically something which you
must have a
discuss in
few
everyday life.
nut jobs somewhere.
There are various nut jobs, but I'm not aware of people like holding up, this is a one-true translation. I do think that they probably exist, but I'm not involved with that. I'm more
it's not
involved
like the
with
King James only gang. Oh God, what is it?
Yeah.
The independent fundamentalist Baptists and the King James is the only inspired word of the Lord and blah 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 blah.
Well, in Germany, I'm not really sort of an outspoken atheist or anything like that. In Germany, I'm pretty much
There's no need to be most of the time, I assume.
Yeah. So I sort of deal with religion and these topics sort of on the internet, but in my private life, I have various other things which I look into and which I discuss. So I'm not that familiar with the German religious scenery.
Yeah, it's I mean, as I understand it, at least with regard to Christianity, it's more liberal, but more kind of part of tradition, you know, in parts of Europe, as far as I know. It's in North America. Unfortunately, in Canada, we get a lot of this sort of weird fundamentalist stuff floating up. So we get random bits of their cultural bubble that go into, well, particularly rural communities, and they're really very heave-ho on all of that.
Yeah. I mean, as far as fundamentalism goes, like before I learned about it in school, I never, I didn't know that there was such a thing as a creationist in the 21st century. Like it came as a complete shock to me when I learned that in English class. So I have in my personal life never met anyone who does accept evolution. So, and when I came on the internet and discussed these topics, now I realize that in America, they are much more fringe than they are in Germany.
Yeah. And I mean, creationism, I was raised a creationist, and my parents thought that that it was very harmful for children to believe evolution. But I've sort of been looking back to figure out where that came from. And as far as I can tell, it's William Jennings Bryan in the early 20th century. He started the Sunday school movement, and he wrote these articles, some of which have been compressed into a book. And he was just deeply convinced that because evolution undermined the authority of the Bible, because everything about Christianity, especially fundamentalist and evangelical, is some version of respect my authority. Yeah, I Cartman, I know, but still, it is that kind of, I have the authority.
Respect my authority.
Respect my authority. Yeah, it's all about authorities. So then when you do that, you've got like, evolution can't be true because that would conflict with the Bible's authority. So, and then he feared this whole falling away from literal evangelicalism. So he pressed for the Sunday school movement to take small children and really strongly indoctrinate with them with the core tenets, including an abhorrence of evolution as being, an affront to our dignity of being made in God's image. And then that's been, I honestly think, a major part of the cause and history of the evangelical movement today.
Yeah. As far as the dignity thing goes, I would argue that, the animals are not made in God's image either, according to a Christian worldview, but we don't treat animals like, often we do treat them like shit, but we also recognize that we shouldn't just randomly shoot puppies because they're not worth it.
We're getting better as we recognize more and more empathy. That's been a big part of moral progress, was including more people in the in-group.
So what I think is that we also seem to agree that animals also have dignity. So I don't see a big issue with human dignity being lost through evolution when human dignity can come from other places.
Well, in a way, it comes from ourselves. If you don't respect yourself, I'm pretty sure you're not going to receive much respect from others. And it's a balance between the selfish and the social aspects, because everything is not all or nothing. Usually you have to incorporate parts of two ends of things and find balance and a reasonable middle ground. Unfortunately, I truly believe that faith is the antipathy of that. And I believe that the method of faith and believing things on conviction as opposed to on evidence is not something that there can be any compromise with, because every time we've tried to compromise, it has not gone well.
I agree with that. Maybe is there another question for us, John, or?
I
keep muting myself and forgetting I'm muted. I'm sitting over here talking at you and it's not coming through. But no questions that I've seen thus far after the last two that Lilith caught herself. There was a couple statements that
one of the worst effects of feminism is the idea that empathy equals morality. I'm like, what is the problem with that? Well, it's the driving force. It's not as simple as just empathy and reason, obviously. But
empathy and a sense of well-being, the fact that we're social creatures, all that goes into
parts of those things. But if you want to make good decisions, you need reason and good information too, because otherwise you're going to make dumb decisions and not get what you want, because bad information, bad choices.
Empathy is a big part of why we have morality, and that's why I sent back to Thomistic that exactly no God needed. as far as morality is concerned.
Actually,
Also
God must not be involved, because that's just another totally subjective opinion, except it's a big opinion with a big stick.
Also, one thing which one can say about morality, even if we did not have empathy, there's still something to say about it's boiling down to simple pragmatism, because if I wanted to...
That wasn't, no, I'm sorry. I was reacting to something that someone posted in the chat, Renee. I didn't mean to sigh out loud.
No, it's no problem, because let's say I wanted to murder a person, but there's also the thing about prison, and I don't want to go to prison. So if my desire to not go to prison is stronger than my desire to murder another person, then I probably will not murder another person, because I want to avoid that. So it's also simple pragmatism.
Yeah. And I mean, social ostracization, even if you didn't go to prison. But there's one thing I think is a good example of this, if you don't mind my saying. As you know, I live in Canada, and unfortunately, we bitch about things, and unfortunately, I think some Republicans heard us bitching about our healthcare and took us seriously. Don't do that. It's a pastime. We bitch about things. That's what we do. We have coffee and we bitch, because in winter, there's not a whole hell of a lot else you can do except go skiing, and that costs $3,000 for a weekend. So, But my mom and several friends at work were just bitching about taxes. Just, blah, 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 blah. But there was a woman who had moved, I believe, from a more rural part of India, but I'm not entirely sure. And this was several years ago. And she said, I would pay any amount of taxes not to be stepping over bodies in the streets. And everyone shut right up, because she's right.
Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah. Well, and that's why we pay the taxes we do, because we have health care. And that's a good thing. There are options for people when you have hard times. It's not to say that it fixes everything and that nobody ever slips through the cracks. But
I want to address something here that, wait a minute. I just clicked on, I almost blocked somebody because I'm scrolling on my phone, and sometimes like the menu pops up. But no, I want to address and have you guys address some sheer nonsense that was just posted in the live chat. Morality without God devolves into hedonism, and I believe they said a motivism. They spelled it kind of weird. I mean, the morality without God devolves into hedonism. I don't understand that claim at all.
Well, I think I might be able to give a possible interpretation. I can't obviously read this poor bastard's mind. But one of the big things that has helped the church gain control is to control people's pleasures, sexuality being a huge part of that, but by no means the only part. Gluttony is a sin as well, and all of these things. And they're given, too much rage, too much anger, too much of anything is a sin. And by couching it as a sin, you take away your responsibility to other people or minimize it significantly by making it your responsibility to God and by extension the church. And this becomes a powerful element of control. Hedonism is a bogeyman, because then people would just have sex when they wanted and drink when they wanted and do whatever they wanted, and that would be evil. And yet no one can tell me why it's evil, provided that we apply to actual moral standards, not the moral standard so-called of, say, Christianity, where it all has to be in marriage and blah, 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 and be very, very boring and heterosexual, and only with, there's additional rules within that depending what group you belong to. But I don't have a problem with people drinking when they want, so long as they don't do things that endanger others, like drive after. I don't have a problem with consenting adults having as much sex as they want whenever they want, as long as they don't involve me without my consent. That includes doing it on the street corner. Don't do that. you can abstain from things when you want. You can indulge in things when you choose. All you really need to consider are the actual, real consequences of your actions in reality which exists, that we're all a part of. And the fear of hedonism it's a bit of a bogeyman, because there is such a thing as overindulgence and harmful overindulgence, but we don't need God for that. We can tell why alcoholism is harmful. You know, we can tell why unsafe sex practices are harmful. They do you harm, and usually other people too. You know, we don't need any kind of religious justification for that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Renee.
One thing which I would say is that, you know, morality devolving into hedonism, that's pretty much an argument from consequences. Even if morality does devolve into hedonism without God, that's not a good reason to invoke God, right?
And Thomistic, under hedonism, rape is not good. And also, fuck off. Seriously.
Bully the Aunt Billy says that Lilith, this is ridiculous, but that you need to look up the definition of sin in the church.
Is this going to be the version where it's just shooting and not hitting the mark, or is it going to be the version which apparently is part of how that term was derived through archery? Because they like to try and make it like it's not really your fault you're sinning, but they also tell you you deserve to go to hell because you're a sinner. It's really fun. Are we going to go with the original sin? Are we going to talk about a Calvinistic type of total depravity of man? Are we going to talk about sin actions, original sin as a state of being? What Christian definition of sin would you like me to address, Billy? If he responds, do let me know.
Well, to be fair, he's Bully the anti-Billy, so yeah.
Yeah, I can't imagine why. Yeah. Apparently, I'm strawmanning by bringing up one of Calvin's 5 points. Because we all know that John Calvin is not in any way a Christian theologian that has had any major impact today. That's crazy.
I think you should do another Bible drop on that one.
No, that I need a John Calvin book, and I only have a digital version of that. So, yeah, John Calvin, it's important to understand his doctrines and the writings of Martin Luther to understand Protestant thinking, but oh my God, it's like listening to Death and Pestilence having a conversation. They're terrible people. They're just terrible.
So where do you think we're at in this conversation, folks?
Well, I feel like it's been over an hour. So do you want to wrap up soon, Renee?
I don't know. Like I would maybe have another half an hour, but it's up to you. So I'll leave it up to you.
Apparently Calvinists are dumb, but you can't say they haven't affected Christian thought. So does anyone in the chat have an actual clear question that they would want to throw into this conversation before we wrap things up?
Not that I'm seeing right here, but boy, maybe we should just bring Thomistic in, to the stream so that he could educate us. Like, sounds like he thinks he knows a lot more than you guys. I'm being sarcastic, by the way. I'm being sarcastic, by the way.
Sweet. Yeah. I'm not saying I'm a professional theologian, but I haven't seen many who could educate me on anything Christian.
Mm-hmm.
But, that's another thing. They think if you've read something, it's the same as agreeing with it. That's why they don't understand that I've already read pretty much everything of C.S. Lewis. That doesn't mean I can't see the problems, but anyway, no questions. Thanks for asking. Okay, thank you, Pax. CC Slipper. Okay, someone's asking what the nature of God is, so that would be great. But unfortunately, that will take well, that would be a whole nother at least 2-hour conversation. And I need more coffee and probably some rum in that coffee if we're going to be doing that.
Well, I don't know if you guys covered this in the last stream you did, but let me just ask both of you, you know, Lilith, what social platforms you're on? I mean, are you just part of Veritas Voices, or do you have your own like YouTube channel? Or?
I have a YouTube channel. I've only just started it recently, and so I'm coming up with things. It's still very much in its infancy, so I welcome suggestions. What can I say? I'm learning. I didn't exactly start as a video maker. I've been on Twitter for longer as @LilithLiberated, which should be in the description of this video after. And then those are my two main platforms. I also I have written a blog for a while. I've left it alone. So I'm going to be writing again on the Humanist Codex. And I've had one come out. I've got another piece that I really want to put on there soon, and that's coming together more. So hopefully we'll be able to use the Humanist Codex more in future for hangouts and chats and things. And I have also opened up a conversation topic on there if anyone wants to ask questions with regard to evangelical belief and that. And I need to get a Discord. You're right, Billy. But I do not yet have that. I'll see what I can do this week.
So,
and Renee, what platforms are you on, or do you have your own YouTube channel?
I have my own YouTube account, but I don't upload with that. I use it for Google Hangouts, use it for commenting. I'm very active on Twitter. I've been there for, I think, close to 3 years by now. I also have my own blog, which is also part of my Twitter profile. Like if you go to my Twitter profile @Renevelation, you then can find a link to my blog. I sort of started it recently. I do put out some more stuff concerning blog posts than I did in the immediate past, but also not like every day, but you know, every 2 to 3 weeks maybe. And I'm also like part of this project with Lilith and with Nick and with Pink Heretic, which we want to start. So those are the things which I'm doing as far as social media goes.
Just to respond to CC Sleeper, yeah, I don't know if it's in the video description, but I will get the link to the GDC Discord and put it in the description.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for filling in, John. I know it was short notice with Nick having to run away and do whatever family things, but you know, life happens to all of us.
Yeah.
Yep. I just want to take a minute and talk about a couple things in my world. First of all, I want to thank the folks from last night that joined me on the GDC. Sock Account was the feature channel, and we had on Dave McGinnis and Jim Majors, Sweet Heathen, Immutable Destiny, and we debated several different topics of a light nature, and it was real fun. I just want to thank them for coming by. Tomorrow night here on the GDC at 9 o'clock Eastern, or I'm sorry, it's not on the GDC. It's on Sock Account's channel. Sokka, one word, count, second word, Sock Account YouTube channel. He's going to be joined by Nick Suter and Shannon Q, and I'll be there to mod and keep an eye on the live chat. And they're going to be discussing counter apologetics and different styles of counter apologetics, which ones are most effective.
Interesting, very interesting. I hope you'll post that in the description as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, as soon as Sokka creates the event and I see the thumbnail on it, I'll tweet about it and put it in the description here. Also, I just want to announce real quick, I did start my own new channel. It's called the Amateur Conversationalist, and I'll continue to do like the topic-based panel discussions that I've been doing every Saturday here on the GDC for as long as Steve will have me, and anything else he wants me to do. The channel I created, there isn't any content on yet. I want to have one-on-one conversations on that channel, and I'm also going to be bringing people on, like where two people might be at odds with one another, and bring them on for a discussion and see if we can, you know, patch things up or mediate any kind of disputes like that. So
oh
that's
dear,
all I have.
you're a brave man. You're a brave man. Well, I mean, hey, let us know. I'm always interested in discussions, and if there's anything you want to, yeah, have discussions about, that always sounds like a lot of fun. But thank you again for doing this, and thank you, Renee, for proposing divine hiddenness, which sort of morphed into a discussion of apologetic and anti-apologetic arguments on its own, but more the arguments than the tactics.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone in the live chat. I don't even know what's going on in there sometimes, but such is life. It's been a very interesting hour. Thank you for tuning into the second Veritas Voices, and I hope everyone has a wonderful Sunday. And hey, it's a holy day. Don't forget to sin.